ACR, a very commonly used stat that tells us about the auction clearance rate, basically the percentage of auction properties that are sold in an auction. If you look at what REIV says about it, REIV calculates clearance rates by adding up the properties sold before the auction, sales under the hammer, sales after the auction but on the same day, and sales the day after the auction, and they divide them by the number of auctions reported. What it basically tells us that how many properties go on, the properties that go on auction, how many of them were sold when they actually went to auction. And I think there's a 48-52% stats, 48-52% bifurcation between 48% of the properties that actually go on the market in an auction and 52% that are sold privately. That's the Melbourne stats, I think, because I know this because I did a agents rep course, and in the course they told me that they are 48-52% kind of ratio that they have in Melbourne. ACR, if it's 75% or some or more, basically means that the demand's really high. That means the properties that are going in under the hammer are actually being sold. Excuse me. And the higher the ACR, the higher the demand versus supply. However, there's actually everything you've got to look at from a bird's eye view and look at what the overall picture is. What you got to understand is that because only 48% of the properties actually go into auction, what's happening with the other 52? So ACR is only telling you about the 48% of the properties that actually went to auction. So Terry Ryder, he's a property guru, and he talks about, he says the same thing, that they only represent a tiny share of the residential property sales. So you can't really base your decision on ACR alone. So let's look at some ACR. I'll look at this is one site, which is realestateview.com.au, but the problem is that they only report these stats for Victoria, New South Wales, and Tassie. If you look at them, if you sign up here, I think they send you an email every week about what the auction clearance rates were, the top 5 apartments, the top bargain flats, and that can help you keep an eye on what's going on in the market. So have a look at this website if you are from Victoria, New South Wales, or Tassie. I generally look at this site, which is a really good site, because in an instant it actually gives me a broad overview of year-to-date Melbourne-wide clearance rate is 71%. But look at this, clearance rate is below, dark blue is when it's below the Melbourne-wide clearance rate. And if you look at the light blue portion, which is basically clearance is above the Melbourne-wide clearance rate. So they've got Melbourne-wide clearance rate 71%, which is like a benchmark or an average across Melbourne. And they quickly highlight the suburbs that are above the average and the ones that are below the average. So if you look at these suburbs, click on this is Glen Waverley, and you look at the clearance rate, 86.7%. That's what I was talking. I took Glen Waverley as an example because I live in this area. I see what's happening in this area every day. And as I mentioned, that Glen Waverley has shown a really good. We saw about an 18% growth in units and about 10% growth in houses. So these are the areas that tell you what it is. Recently, somebody asked me if I wanted to do a 3 townhouse development in Glen Waverley, and I declined the offer. The reason was basically they had a site, and the site was good, everything was great, but I wouldn't want to get into this market when it's actually right at the top of it. So if you look at sold at auction, total auction, 105 properties went into auction, and 91 of them were sold. And as I said, the reason is probably the ones that did not sell were actually sitting outside the school zone. That's my guess is, and the ones that actually did sell were actually in the school zone. So if you look at Mount Waverley at the same time, again 84.8%. That's what, because it's at the peak of the market. So I wouldn't want to get into an area where it's already peaked. So and auction clearance rates are not the only criteria that I look at. I also look at other different stats, but from the look of it, it actually quickly tells me that these dark blue are actually where the clearance area is actually below. So which is about 54.5%. That means it's not doing that well, but that doesn't mean that the area is bad. It's just that what you're developing, what's going into auction, not a lot of them are clearing that quickly. So it might have longer days on the market, um, but there could be other factors affecting the growth in that area. So that's how I look at it. But this is a really good clearance map. Well, not the clearance map, but auction clearance rates by suburb. But it actually gives me a really good snapshot of what suburbs are doing well, what suburbs are not doing well, and I can click on it and say, okay, Wyndham Vale clearance rate's gone up to 77.8%, which is pretty good. But look at the size of the sample size. Total went to auctions 9, sold 7. But I would want to know what's the stock on the market in this area, which will be our next stat that we'll look at. And yeah, so that's how I look at clearance rates.